Tonight, we're going to travel slowly across a very long stretch of time. We'll move back beyond cities and agriculture, beyond memory and recorded history, into a world shaped by climate, land, and quiet adaptation. This is a story that unfolds over millions of years, following the gradual emergence of human life, the many forms it once took, and the slow processes that shaped how people lived, moved, and changed. Along the way, we'll pass through ancient landscapes that no longer exist. We'll follow small groups as they adapt to shifting environments, learn to work stone, live with fire, communicate, and eventually spread into new regions. We'll spend time with other human populations who lived alongside us, shared parts of our ancestry, and then slowly faded from the world. And we'll end by returning to the present, placing modern life within the much longer history that came before it. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable wherever you are. Let your breathing settle and allow the pace of the day to soften. And if you'd like to, you're very welcome to leave a comment and share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Many people enjoy knowing that others, in different places and under different skies, are listening at the same time, sharing this quiet moment. When you're ready, let the present drift a little farther away and join me as we step back into deep time, into the long history of human origins, and into a world before memory. For most of the planet's history, there was no one to observe it. The Earth moved through time without witnesses, shaped by forces that left marks only in stone, ice, and the slow layering of sediment. Mountains rose where oceans had once spread, and seas returned to places that had long been dry. Nothing recorded these changes as events. They unfolded as conditions, lasting far longer than any single form of life could persist. Time at this scale did not pass in moments or generations. It moved in spans measured by pressure, erosion, and gradual shifts in temperature. Ice sheets expanded across continents and then retreated, not once, but many times. Forests advanced into open land and later withdrew, replaced by grasslands or desert as climates altered their balance. These changes were not rare disruptions. They were part of a repeated pattern that defined the planet's surface. Life adjusted to these movements without awareness. Species appeared, spread, adapted, and disappeared as conditions changed around them. Some forms lasted for millions of years, others for far less. Extinction was not an ending in any meaningful sense. It was one of the ways the planet redistributed life, opening space for new arrangements to take shape. Over long periods, the Earth did not accumulate stability. It cycled through difference. The atmosphere itself was altered repeatedly, shaped by volcanic activity, shifting oceans, and the slow work of organisms that changed its composition without intention. Oxygen levels rose and fell. Carbon moved between air, water, and rock. These processes continued regardless of which creatures happened to be present at the time. Life influenced the planet, but it did not guide it. Across these long spans, no form stood apart from the systems around it. Animals and plants existed within narrow ranges of temperature and moisture, dependent on conditions they could not control. When those conditions shifted beyond what they could tolerate, populations declined and vanished. Others expanded into the space left behind. The pattern repeated, without direction and without pause. During colder periods, ice locked away water and reshaped coastlines. Sea levels dropped, exposing land bridges that connected regions now separated by oceans. During warmer intervals, ice melted back and rising seas submerged those same pathways. Each cycle rearranged the living world. Creatures moved, adapted, or disappeared as habitats changed position or dissolved entirely. There was no single climate that could be called normal. The planet moved between states, sometimes slowly, sometimes more abruptly, depending on the forces at work. Long stretches of relative stability were interrupted by periods of sharper change, driven by shifts in orbit, volcanic activity, or the slow drift of continents. None of these changes carried meaning. They were conditions, not events. Through all of this, there was no memory. Nothing marked what had come before or anticipated what would follow. The surface of the planet held traces of past life, but these were not records in any human sense. Fossils formed quietly beneath layers of sediment, preserving fragments of bodies that once moved, fed, and reproduced without awareness of their own impermanence. If one could observe the Earth from a distance during these ages, there would be no indication of what might later appear. There were no signs pointing towards cities, tools, or language. No form of life carried the outline of a future that would eventually include humans. Evolution did not work toward a destination. It responded to immediate pressures and local conditions, producing forms suited only to the moment in which they existed. The mammals that would one day give rise to human ancestors were small and unremarkable for much of this time. They lived alongside many other creatures, none of which held a privileged position in the landscape. Survival depended on adaptation, not dominance. No species controlled the environment. All were subject to it. As climates shifted, populations fragmented and reformed. Groups were isolated by ice, water, or changing vegetation, then later brought back into contact as conditions altered again. These separations and reunions shaped the course of life in subtle ways, producing variation without intention. Over long periods, small differences accumulated, though none carried any sense of purpose. The planet itself did not distinguish between survival and disappearance. Both were outcomes of the same processes. Life persisted overall, but individual forms were temporary, shaped by conditions that would eventually change beyond their tolerance. The Earth continued through these cycles without awareness and without memory. It was within this vast, impersonal setting that the conditions for something new slowly began to take shape. Not suddenly and not everywhere, but in small regions where climate, geography, and biology aligned for a time. Even then, nothing about these early developments suggested what would eventually follow. They were responses to immediate circumstances, no different in principle from countless other adaptations that had appeared and vanished before. At this stage, humans were not absent. They were not delayed. They were simply not part of the world yet. The planet existed comfortably without them, governed by processes that did not anticipate their arrival and would continue long after. The Earth remained the central presence, shaping life through temperature, water, and terrain. Time continued to move at its own pace, indifferent to the forms that passed across the surface. Within this long continuity, change accumulated quietly, setting the conditions for future transformations that, at this moment, were still unimaginable. Over long stretches of time, the planet did not remain still. Conditions shifted gradually, then shifted again, driven by forces that operated far beyond the scale of any single life. Temperature changed first by small degrees and later by wider margins, altering the balance between land, ice, and water. These changes did not arrive as sudden shocks. They spread slowly, reshaping environments over thousands of years. Ice sheets expanded outward from the poles during colder periods, pressing across continents and covering vast regions beneath layers of frozen mass. Rivers were redirected, coastlines were redrawn, and entire ecosystems were displaced. As the climate warmed, the ice receded, releasing water back into the oceans and exposing land that had been locked away for generations of animals. These movements repeated many times, each cycle rearranging the surface of the planet. Forests followed the shifting climate. In warmer and wetter intervals, trees advanced into open ground, forming dense woodlands where grasslands had once stretched. When conditions dried or cooled, forests thinned and withdrew, replaced by plains or scrub. Deserts expanded and contracted as rainfall patterns changed. None of these landscapes held a permanent position. Each existed only as long as the climate allowed. Animals adjusted to these changes as part of their daily existence. Populations moved slowly as habitats shifted, following food sources and tolerable temperatures. Some species developed thicker coats, altered diets, or different patterns of movement as conditions changed around them. Others adapted by occupying narrower ranges, surviving within limited environments until those spaces disappeared. Adaptation did not guarantee persistence. When change outpaced a species' ability to adjust, numbers declined. Breeding slowed, ranges shrank, and populations fragmented into smaller groups. Some disappeared entirely, leaving behind no trace except in the fossil record. Others expanded into newly available territory as competitors vanished. These outcomes were not exceptional. They were a regular part of life within a changing system. During colder intervals, large mammals became common across open landscapes, supported by grasses that thrived in cooler, drier conditions. As the climate warmed, these environments shifted, favoring different plants and animals. Species that had flourished under one set of conditions found themselves confined or displaced under another. Over time, the composition of animal communities changed repeatedly, reflecting the movement of climate rather than any internal direction. Water availability played a central role in these transformations. Rainfall patterns shifted with temperature, altering rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Some regions became more hospitable, drawing in plant and animal life, while others dried and grew less predictable. Animals followed water when they could, adjusting migration routes and seasonal behaviors to match new conditions. These changes unfolded without awareness. Animals did not recognize long-term patterns or anticipate future shifts. They responded to immediate pressures, adjusting behavior and physiology where possible, and failing where adaptation was insufficient. Survival depended on flexibility within narrow limits, not on foresight or planning. Across generations, small differences accumulated within populations. Groups separated by ice, water, or changing vegetation followed slightly different paths as they adapted to local conditions. Over long periods, these differences became more pronounced, producing variation within species and, at times, entirely new forms. This process unfolded quietly, guided by environment rather than intention. The planet continued to cycle through colder and warmer states, reshaping land and life each time. No single arrangement lasted long enough to become permanent. Change was the prevailing condition even when it moved slowly. Within this restless system, life persisted by adjusting again and again, shaped by forces it could not influence and could not escape. For much of this time, life moved without any shared system of meaning. There was no language to carry information beyond immediate signals, and no way to preserve experience beyond the moment in which it occurred. Knowledge did not accumulate across generations. Each life began with little more than instinct and observation, shaped by surroundings that offered no explanation and no reassurance. Fire did not yet play a role in daily survival. Warmth came from sunlight, shelter from vegetation or terrain, and movement in response to changing weather. Nights were governed by darkness and temperature rather than by any attempt to alter them. Activity followed daylight, and rest followed the loss of it, not by design but by necessity. Without fire, food remained limited to what could be gathered or consumed in its natural state. Diets shifted with the seasons, narrowing during periods of scarcity and expanding when conditions allowed. Survival depended on proximity to resources rather than on storage or planning. When environments changed, populations moved or declined, constrained by the same limits that shaped all other animals. There were no stories to explain the world or bind individuals together across time. Experience ended with the individual. Signals of danger, opportunity, or social presence existed only in the present, conveyed through movement, sound, or scent. Once the moment passed, it left no trace that could be recalled or shared later. Social groups formed and dissolved according to immediate conditions. Individuals remained close when safety or access to resources required it, and separated when pressures eased. These groupings were shaped by environment rather than choice, changing as landscapes shifted or resources became scarce. There was no lasting structure beyond what conditions enforced. The land itself directed behavior. Rivers guided movement, open plains exposed those who crossed them, and dense vegetation limited visibility and access. Shelter came from terrain rather than construction, and safety depended on familiarity with local features. When climates shifted, these familiar spaces changed, forcing adjustment or retreat. Animals lived within these constraints without awareness of long-term change. They responded to hunger, weather, and immediate threat, repeating patterns that worked until conditions altered. When established behaviors no longer matched the environment, survival became less certain. Some adapted gradually, others failed to adjust. Across long spans of time, these pressures shaped bodies and behavior in small ways. Differences in size, strength, and movement accumulated slowly within populations. These changes reflected local conditions rather than any broader direction. Variation emerged because environments differed, not because life moved toward complexity. The absence of language, fire, and memory did not mark a lack. It was simply the state of life at this point. The world functioned within these limits, and living beings occupied it fully, responding to what was immediately present and nothing more. There was no awareness of what might follow, and no capacity to imagine a different way of living. Within this long silence, the planet continued its cycles. Climate shifted, landscapes altered, and populations adjusted again and again. The conditions that would later allow new forms of behavior were taking shape slowly, embedded within ordinary survival. At this moment, they remained indistinguishable from countless other adaptations that had appeared and disappeared before, leaving no mark beyond their brief presence in the world. Over time, changes in climate and landscape placed new pressures on life in certain regions. Forests that had once provided continuous cover began to thin and break apart, giving way to mixed environments of woodland, grass, and open ground. These shifts altered how animals moved through space and how they accessed food, shelter, and safety. For some populations, remaining low to the ground or dependent on dense vegetation became less reliable. Within this setting, small-bodied primates living in parts of eastern and southern Africa began to move differently. They still climbed, rested, and fed among trees when conditions allowed, but they also spent increasing amounts of time on the ground. Movement between patches of vegetation required crossing exposed areas, where speed, balance, and awareness mattered in new ways. Australopithecus emerged within these mixed landscapes. These populations did not appear suddenly, nor did they replace what came before in any clear sequence. They existed alongside other animals, adapted to similar conditions, shaped by the same constraints of food availability, predation, and climate. Their bodies reflected these pressures rather than any singular direction. One of the most noticeable changes was the growing use of upright posture during movement. Walking on two legs did not transform daily life at once. It appeared gradually, unevenly, and alongside older forms of movement. Individuals still climbed when necessary and rested when conditions required it. Upright walking was one option among several. used when it offered practical advantages. This form of movement altered how the body carried weight and distributed effort. The pelvis shifted in shape, the spine curved differently, and the legs lengthened relative to the arms. These changes did not occur within a single lifetime or even across a few generations. They accumulated slowly, passed on as slight variations that proved workable under local conditions. Walking upright freed the hands during movement, though this did not immediately lead to new forms of tool use or coordination. Hands were already capable of grasping and manipulation. The change lay in how often they were available while moving across the landscape. Carrying food, infants, or gathered materials became more manageable over short distances, fitting into existing patterns of survival. Upright posture also changed how individuals viewed their surroundings. Height offered a wider field of vision in open terrain, allowing earlier detection of threats or opportunities. This advantage remained limited and situational, useful in some environments and less so in others. It did not remove vulnerability, nor did it grant control over the landscape. The shift toward walking placed new demands on the body. Joints, muscles, and bones were subjected to different stresses, increasing the risk of injury. Adaptations that improved balance and reduced strain were favored where they aligned with environmental needs. Where they did not, they faded from the population over time. Australopithecus lived within these constraints, adapting to what the environment allowed rather than reshaping it. Daily life remained focused on finding food, avoiding danger, and maintaining social bonds within small groups. There was no awareness of anatomical change as change. Bodies simply reflected what worked, often enough to persist. These populations remained limited in number and range. They did not spread widely or alter their surroundings in lasting ways. Their significance lies not in what they initiated, but in how they responded to conditions present at the time. Upright walking was one such response, shaped by terrain and climate rather than by any broader purpose. As generations passed, these small adjustments accumulated quietly. The landscape continued to shift, and with it, the balance between trees and open ground. Within this ongoing movement, the way bodies met the world changed slightly, setting conditions that would later interact with other pressures still to come. As conditions continued to shift across parts of Africa, some populations began to rely more heavily on materials found at hand. Stones scattered across riverbeds and open ground became part of daily movement, encountered repeatedly as individuals travelled familiar routes. These materials did not draw attention at first. They were part of the environment, shaped by weather and time rather than by living beings. Within certain groups, small changes in behaviour began to appear. Stones were picked up, turned, and struck against one another. The actions were simple and repeated, guided by immediate needs rather than by planning or design. When a sharp edge resulted, it was noticed and used. When it did not, the stone was discarded without concern. Early members of the genus Homo lived within these patterns. Their bodies were similar in many ways to those of earlier populations, though some features reflected continued adjustment to life on the ground. Hands were capable of a wide range of movement, allowing a firm grip as well as more controlled pressure. These traits did not exist for the purpose of toolmaking. They proved useful when interaction with hard materials became more frequent. The shaping of stone did not require instruction or shared understanding. Individuals learned through repetition, observing outcomes and adjusting movements over time. A successful strike was not remembered as a concept, but as a sensation of force and angle that could be repeated. Over many attempts, certain motions produced reliable results. The tools that emerged from this process were limited in form and function. Sharp flakes cut through skin and plant matter more efficiently than unworked stone. Heavy cores could be used to break bone or crush hard materials. These objects did not circulate widely or remain in use for long. They were made when needed and left behind when circumstances changed. Tool use did not separate these populations from the environments they inhabited. It fit within existing routines of movement and foraging. Stones were collected along the way, shaped briefly, and then abandoned. There was no accumulation of equipment and no lasting modification of the landscape. The use of tools altered daily activity in subtle ways. Access to new food sources became possible, particularly where animals or plants required cutting or breaking. This did not remove uncertainty from survival. It added another option within a narrow range of responses to changing conditions. Variation emerged gradually. Some individuals became more consistent in producing usable edges, while others relied less on stone. These differences reflected opportunity and circumstance, rather than ability or intention. Where suitable materials were common, tool use appeared more frequently. Where they were scarce, behavior adjusted accordingly. The process remained slow and uneven. Tool-making did not spread rapidly or transform social life. It remained one practice among many, shaped by availability and need. Knowledge was not stored or formalized. Each generation repeated the same trial and error process, guided by immediate outcomes rather than by memory of past success. Within these limits, the shaping of stone became part of ordinary life for some groups. Hands met material repeatedly, responding to resistance and fracture. Over time, these interactions left subtle marks on behavior and anatomy alike, reflecting continued adjustment to a world that offered few certainties and little margin for error. The populations living at this stage remained small and widely scattered. Groups occupied limited territories shaped by water, vegetation, and the movement of animals they depended on. These were not continuous ranges, but clusters of habitation separated by long stretches of land that could not reliably support life. Movement between these areas was possible, though never without risk. Survival did not depend on control over the environment. These groups lacked the numbers, tools, or coordination to dominate landscapes or other species. Daily life required constant adjustment to local conditions, with little margin for error. When food became scarce or weather patterns shifted, options were limited. Groups moved when they could, and diminished when they could not. Population size shaped every aspect of existence. Small numbers reduced competition within groups, but they also increased vulnerability. Illness, injury, or the loss of a few individuals could alter the balance of a group's ability to gather food or protect itself. Recovery from loss took time and depended on favorable conditions that were not always present. These communities did not expand steadily or uniformly. Some persisted in the same regions for long periods, while others disappeared without leaving clear traces. Extinction at this scale did not arrive as a sudden event. It unfolded through gradual decline as birth slowed, ranges contracted, and contact between groups diminished. Different human populations existed at the same time in separate regions, shaped by distinct environments. Some adapted to wooded areas, others to open plains or shifting coastal zones. These differences did not imply advancement or limitation. They reflected local conditions and the narrow set of responses available within them. Interaction between groups occurred when ranges overlapped or when movement brought populations into contact. These encounters were irregular and often brief. Exchange of materials or behavior was possible, though it depended on circumstance rather than intention. Separation remained the more common condition, reinforcing variation across regions. There was no single path that all human populations followed. Many forms existed simultaneously, each responding to pressures in its own way. Some proved compatible with long-term survival in changing environments, while others did not. The persistence of any group depended less on inherent traits than on alignment with local conditions over time. The lives lived within these small groups were constrained and uncertain. Daily effort focused on meeting immediate needs rather than securing future advantage. Planning beyond the near term was limited by the unpredictability of climate, resources, and movement. Stability, when it appeared, was temporary. Within this broader pattern, humans were one experiment among many. Their presence did not signal inevitability or dominance. They occupied fragile positions within complex systems, shaped by the same forces that governed all other life. Continuity depended on adaptation that remained local, contingent, and always subject to change. By this point, human presence did not take a single form. Across different regions, populations had followed separate paths shaped by climate, geography, and long periods of isolation. These groups shared distant ancestry, but their lives unfolded under different conditions, producing bodies and behaviors that reflected local demands rather than any shared direction. Several human species existed at the same time. Their timelines overlapped for long periods, measured not in brief encounters, but in tens of thousands of years. No single group replaced another in a clear sequence. Instead, populations appeared, persisted, and disappeared while others continued alongside them. Some lived in colder northern regions, adapting to seasonal scarcity and extended winters. Others remained closer to equatorial environments, where resources followed different rhythms. These populations were separated by distance, terrain, and shifting climates, which limited contact and reinforced difference. Each group lived within the boundaries set by its surroundings. Daily life across these populations shared broad similarities. All depended on movement through familiar territory, knowledge of local plants and animals, and cooperation within small groups. Yet the details varied. Diets reflected available food. Shelter took forms suited to climate and materials. Patterns of movement followed water, animals, and seasonal change. These groups did not experience themselves as part of a larger human story. Their awareness extended only to the land they knew and the people they encountered. Other human populations existed beyond that range, unseen and unknown, living parallel lives shaped by similar pressures but unfolding independently. Where ranges came close or briefly overlapped, contacts became possible. These encounters were shaped by circumstance rather than intention. They did not form a continuous network connecting all human groups. Separation remained the dominant condition, allowing differences to persist and deepen over time. The existence of multiple human species did not create a hierarchy. No form possessed inherent control over the others. Survival depended on alignment with local conditions rather than on comparison or competition across regions. Each population remained vulnerable to changes it could not influence. The planet continued to change around them. Climate shifts, altered migration routes, vegetation, and the availability of animals. Some populations adjusted and remained. Others declined as conditions moved beyond what their bodies or behaviors could accommodate. These outcomes unfolded gradually, without recognition or record. For long periods, the world held many human forms at once. They shared a common origin far in the past, but their present lives were shaped by separation. Humanity existed as a scattered set of populations, connected by ancestry but divided by distance, each adapting within its own narrow limits. In colder regions of Eurasia, human populations adapted to conditions that placed constant demands on the body. Winters were long, daylight was limited, and food sources shifted with the seasons. Survival required close attention to terrain, weather, and the movement of animals that could be followed across open ground or forest edge. Neanderthals lived within these environments for many generations. Their bodies reflected the demands of cold and physical effort. Stockier builds reduced heat loss, and strong limbs supported frequent movement across uneven ground. These features did not separate them from their surroundings. They allowed daily life to continue within narrow margins set by climate. Daily routines were shaped by necessity rather than choice. Groups moved within familiar ranges, returning to places that offered shelter or reliable resources. Caves, rock overhangs, and natural breaks in the landscape provided protection from wind and cold. These locations were used repeatedly, forming patterns of occupation that followed seasonal change. Food gathering required coordination. Hunting large animals involved risk and cooperation, while smaller prey and plant foods filled gaps when conditions allowed. Meals depended on what could be obtained nearby and processed with available tools. There was little surplus. Each day's effort was closely tied to the next. Care within groups played a role in persistence. Evidence suggests that individuals who were injured or impaired sometimes survived longer than would be expected through solitary effort alone. This implies attention given to those unable to contribute fully for periods of time. Such care was not abstract or symbolic. It was practical, shaped by familiarity and shared dependence. Families formed the core of social life. Bonds developed through shared movement, work, and exposure to the same risks. Children learned through observation and participation, absorbing routines that had proven workable within local conditions. Knowledge remained tied to place and experience rather than to instruction or record. These populations did not live in isolation from all others. At times, different human groups occupied nearby regions, separated by distance or terrain rather than by clear boundaries. Contact was possible where ranges approached one another, though it was not constant. Separation remained common, reinforcing distinct ways of living. Neanderthals were not defined by a single pattern of behavior. Across their range, daily life varied according to environment. Some groups relied more heavily on open landscapes, while others occupied wooded areas or mixed terrain. Shelter, diet, and movement adjusted to what each region allowed. Life within these conditions required ongoing adjustment. Weather shifted unpredictably, animals altered migration routes, and familiar resources sometimes failed. Groups responded by moving, changing focus, or reducing activity. Stability, when present, remained temporary. These ways of being persisted for long periods, shaped by local knowledge and repeated practice. They did not point toward a shared future or a single outcome. They existed within their own time, responding to pressures that were immediate and unrelenting, forming lives that were complete within the limits set by their surroundings. As human populations moved and adjusted to shifting environments, their ranges sometimes brought them into proximity with others who shared a distant ancestry. These encounters did not follow a single pattern. They occurred unevenly, shaped by terrain, climate, and the movement of animals and resources that drew groups into the same areas. Contact did not always lead to conflict or separation. In some cases, groups remained close for periods of time, sharing space and adapting to similar conditions. These situations created the possibility for closer bonds to form. Relationships developed through ordinary interaction rather than through deliberate exchange between distinct peoples. Interbreeding occurred within these moments of contact. It was not widespread or continuous, but it happened often enough to leave traces. These connections did not merge populations into a single whole. Groups remained largely separate, shaped by their own environments and routines, even as individuals moved between them. The children born from such unions carried elements from both lineages. These traits reflected bodies that had adapted to different conditions over long periods. Some proved workable within the environments where these children lived. Others faded as populations shifted and circumstances changed. Shared ancestry did not create shared identity. Individuals lived within the groups that raised them, learning local patterns of movement, food gathering, and social behavior. Their lives were defined by immediate surroundings, rather than by distant genetic connections they could not perceive. Over time, the presence of these mixed lineages became part of the broader human landscape. Genetic material moved quietly across populations carried by ordinary lives rather than by large-scale migrations. These movements were gradual, leaving no clear boundary where one group ended and another began. As climates shifted again, some populations declined or disappeared, others persisted, carrying with them traces of earlier contact. These traces did not determine outcomes. They became part of the variation present within surviving groups, interacting with new pressures as environments continued to change. Much later, these connections would remain visible at a biological level. Modern humans carry small portions of genetic material inherited from other human populations that no longer exist. These elements do not tell a single story. They point to moments of contact that occurred within everyday life, without record or recognition at the time. The meeting of different human groups did not resolve difference or create unity. It added complexity to an already varied picture. Humanity remained plural, shaped by movement and separation, with shared ancestry woven unevenly through populations that continued to live within their own local limits. Over time, fire became part of ordinary life for some human groups. It did not arrive as a sudden discovery or spread evenly across regions. Knowledge of how to maintain it appeared gradually, shaped by repeated exposure to natural fires and careful attention to what allowed flame to persist. Fire was rarely created from nothing. More often, it was taken from burning landscapes after lightning strikes or periods of dryness and carried back to places of shelter. Keeping it alive required steady effort. Fuel had to be gathered, embers protected from wind and rain, and attention maintained across hours and days. Once fire could be kept reliably, it began to shape daily routines. Warmth extended activity into colder periods and reduced the immediate pressure of low temperatures. Light made evenings more usable, allowing tasks to continue beyond daylight. These changes did not alter the structure of life all at once. They adjusted it at the margins. Groups gathered around fire repeatedly, returning to the same places where it could be sheltered and maintained. Evenings took on a regular pattern as movement slowed and work narrowed. Food was prepared nearby, tools were handled and repaired, and bodies rested closer together than they could without heat. Fire offered a measure of safety without removing danger. Light discouraged some animals, though it did not eliminate risk. Smoke altered air and scent, changing how spaces were occupied. The presence of fire required awareness, as sparks and shifting embers could damage shelter or burn skin if neglected. The use of fire also changed how food was consumed. Cooking softened plant matter and meat, making it easier to eat and digest. This reduced the time and effort needed for chewing and processing, fitting within existing patterns of foraging rather than replacing them. Maintaining fire encouraged cooperation. Tasks related to fuel, tending, and protection were shared across groups, fitting into daily responsibilities. Knowledge remained practical and situational, passed through observation rather than instruction. Failure to manage fire carried immediate consequences, reinforcing careful attention. The presence of fire did not create new social structures on its own. It settled into existing arrangements, shaping how time was spent and how groups gathered at certain moments of the day. Evenings repeated with small variation, marked by light, warmth, and shared space. Fire did not transform the landscape in lasting ways. Its influence remained local and temporary, bound to the places where it could be maintained. When groups moved, fire moved with them or was lost and found again elsewhere. Within these limits, living with fire became part of ordinary existence. It did not signal a new phase of humanity. It reflected another adjustment to conditions, one that altered daily rhythm without removing uncertainty from life. As groups lived and moved together over long periods, communication became more important to daily coordination. Survival depended on shared attention to food, danger, and movement across the landscape. Gestures, posture, and simple vocal sounds were already part of this process, allowing individuals to respond quickly to what others noticed. Over time, certain sounds began to be used more consistently in specific situations. These vocal signals did not form a structured system, and they were not used to tell stories or describe absent events. They remained closely tied to immediate circumstances, guiding action rather than reflection. Sounds marked the presence of danger, directed attention toward resources, or helped maintain group cohesion during movement. Their meaning depended on context and familiarity, rather than on fixed rules. Individuals learn these associations through repeated experience within their group, adjusting responses as conditions required. This form of communication reduced uncertainty during shared activity. Coordinated movement became more efficient when warnings or signals could be conveyed quickly. Cooperation during hunting or gathering relied on timing and mutual awareness, rather than on detailed planning or instruction. The use of vocal sounds varied between groups. Different environments and patterns of activity shaped how communication developed locally. Some populations relied more heavily on gesture and proximity, while others used sound to bridge distance or poor visibility. These differences did not accumulate into a single system. Communication remained practical and limited in scope. It did not allow for abstract thought or the transmission of complex ideas across generations. Knowledge continued to be learned through participation rather than explanation. Skills were acquired by observing others and repeating actions that produced workable results. The gradual shaping of vocal communication did not alter social structures immediately. Groups remained small, and relationships continued to be defined by shared activity and familiarity. Sound became another tool within existing patterns of cooperation, adjusting how people worked together without changing why they did so. As with earlier adaptations, the development of communication followed no clear direction. It responded to local pressures and opportunities, appearing where it proved useful and remaining limited where it did not. Language, in this early form, remained embedded in daily life, supporting cooperation without extending beyond the present moment. Over time, some groups began to leave marks that extended beyond immediate use. Lines were drawn on stone or earth, and shapes were repeated in places that groups returned to over long periods. These markings did not carry fixed meanings that could be easily transferred. They existed within particular settings, understood through familiarity rather than explanation. Cave walls and sheltered surfaces provided spaces where marks could remain visible. Pigments made from minerals or charcoal were applied by hand or simple tools, producing figures that reflected animals, movement, and forms encountered in daily life. These images did not record events as history. They were placed within environments already known and revisited, becoming part of the spaces people inhabited. The act of marking required time and attention. It took place within moments, set apart from immediate survival tasks, often in locations that offered protection from weather and disturbance. These settings allowed groups to pause, gather, and repeat actions that did not directly secure food or shelter, but fit within the rhythms of shared life. Rituals emerged through repetition rather than design. Certain movements, sounds, or actions were performed in familiar sequences, often tied to places or moments within the seasonal cycle. These practices did not explain the world or impose order upon it. They reinforced shared presence and continuity within groups that faced constant uncertainty. Memory at this stage did not exist as a record of the past. It lived within repeated activity and shared space. Knowledge of where to go, when to gather, and how to behave in certain places was reinforced through participation rather than instruction. Marks and rituals supported this process by anchoring experience to specific locations. Symbols did not function as abstract representations. Their meaning depended on context, proximity, and collective familiarity. Outside the group that created them, they carried little significance. Within the group, they shaped how places were used and how moments were recognized as distinct. The presence of shared marks and practices altered how groups related to their surroundings. Certain locations gained importance not because they offered better resources, but because they held accumulated activity. These places were returned to repeatedly, forming points of reference within wider movement across the landscape. This shared imagination remained limited in scope. It did not extend far beyond the group or persist unchanged across long spans of time. As conditions shifted and populations moved, marks were left behind and practices faded. New ones emerged elsewhere under different pressures. Within these constraints, symbols and ritual became part of daily life. They did not replace practical knowledge or alter survival strategies. They added another layer of continuity, binding people to places and to one another through repeated action rather than through explanation or belief. These early forms of memory did not signal permanence. They existed as long as groups remained connected to the spaces and routines that sustained them. When those connections broke, the marks remained without their meaning, absorbed back into the landscape as life continued to move. Movement beyond familiar regions did not begin as a single decision or shared plan. Groups adjusted their ranges slowly, following water, animals, and vegetation as climates shifted and local conditions changed. Over time, these small adjustments carried some populations beyond the areas their ancestors had occupied for many generations. Leaving did not mean abandoning a known homeland in favor of a new one. It reflected gradual shifts in daily movement, often unnoticed by those living through them. Paths extended slightly farther each season. Camps were established a little beyond previous limits, and return became less frequent as new routes proved workable. Africa remained a central landscape during this process, though its internal diversity shaped movement in many directions. Rivers changed course, lakes expanded or contracted, and grasslands shifted with rainfall patterns. Groups followed these changes rather than any sense of outward movement, responding to local pressures that altered where life could be sustained. As ranges widened, contact between populations increased in some areas and diminished in others. Separation occurred when terrain or climate limited movement, while new connections formed where corridors of land or water made passage possible. These changes unfolded unevenly, producing a scattered pattern of movement rather than a continuous flow. There was no awareness of distance travelled or boundaries crossed. Each group remained focused on immediate surroundings, adapting to conditions encountered along the way. Knowledge accumulated through experience rather than through shared memory of past locations. The landscape ahead held no promise or meaning beyond its capacity to support life. The movement of people mirrored the movement of animals they depended on. Herds shifted grazing grounds in response to vegetation and weather, and human groups followed when they could. When animals altered routes or disappeared, people adjusted accordingly, sometimes changing direction or remaining in place longer than before. These early movements did not lead to rapid expansion. Progress, measured in distance, remained slow. Generations passed without dramatic change as groups settled into new areas and learned their patterns before moving again. Stability, when achieved, was temporary, shaped by the same environmental pressures that had prompted movement. The long migration unfolded without a clear beginning or end. It consisted of many small decisions made within narrow limits, guided by survival rather than curiosity or ambition. Over time, these decisions carried human presence beyond its earlier bounds, not through intent, but through continued adjustment to a changing world. As movement carried some groups beyond familiar terrain, new environments placed different demands on daily life. Coastlines offered access to food that did not follow the same seasonal patterns as inland resources. Shorelines provided shellfish, fish, and seabirds, which could be gathered with regular effort and without long pursuit. These resources did not remove uncertainty, but they allowed groups to remain in places where other food sources were limited. Living near water required adjustment. Tides altered access to shore, storms reshaped beaches, and familiarity with changing conditions became necessary for safety. Knowledge of when and where food could be found developed through repeated presence rather than instruction. Groups learned to time their movements to the rhythms of the coast, returning to productive areas as conditions allowed. In colder regions, seasonal change shaped movement more sharply. Winters reduced available food and increased exposure, while warmer months offered greater mobility. Groups adjusted by altering where they travelled and how long they remained in certain places. These patterns did not follow a fixed calendar. They responded to local conditions that varied from year to year. Adaptation to new climates required changes in material use. Clothing made from animal skins provided protection against cold and wind, though its quality depended on skill and available resources. Tools were modified to suit different tasks, reflecting the demands of hunting, processing food, and maintaining shelter in unfamiliar settings. Food sources varied widely across regions. Inland groups relied more heavily on large animals when conditions permitted, while coastal populations incorporated marine resources into their diets. Plant foods differed by latitude and climate, shaping gathering practices and seasonal movement. These differences did not accumulate into a single pattern of living. Each group adjusted within the limits of its surroundings. Movement along coastlines and through new environments did not proceed evenly. Some routes proved workable for long periods, while others became impassable as sea levels rose or climates shifted. Groups changed direction or remained in place when conditions required, responding to immediate pressures rather than maintaining a sense of forward movement. These adaptations were practical and local. Knowledge developed through experience and was tied closely to place. When groups moved on, much of this understanding lost relevance, requiring new adjustments elsewhere. Continuity depended on flexibility rather than on the transfer of fixed practices. Over time, following coastlines and seasonal change allowed human presence to extend into a wider range of environments. This expansion did not follow a clear path or timeline. It reflected ongoing adjustment to water, temperature, and available food, carried out by small groups responding to conditions as they encountered them. As climates shifted again and movement carried human groups into new regions, the number of distinct human populations began to thin. This change did not arrive through a single event or a clear boundary in time. It unfolded gradually, shaped by small differences in survival, reproduction, and contact that accumulated over many generations. Some populations became isolated as environments changed around them. Rising seas cut off familiar routes, colder periods narrowed habitable zones, and resources that once supported small groups became less reliable. Separation reduced the exchange between populations, limiting opportunities for contact and renewal. Population size played a quiet but decisive role. Groups that remained small faced greater risk when conditions worsened. A series of poor seasons, the loss of a few individuals, or reduced birth rates could shift the balance beyond recovery. Decline often occurred without drama, as numbers slowly fell and movement became more restricted. There was no single pattern to these losses. In some regions, human populations persisted for long periods before fading. In others, disappearance followed relatively quickly after conditions changed. These outcomes reflected local circumstances rather than any shared cause. Absence became noticeable only in retrospect. Places once occupied were no longer returned to, paths fell out of use, and familiar shelters remained empty. Over time, traces of activity weathered away, leaving little to mark where people had once lived. Contact between different human populations grew less frequent. Where ranges no longer overlapped, interaction ceased. Genetic exchange slowed and eventually stopped in many areas, not through conflict, but through distance and declining numbers. The disappearance of other human groups did not result in immediate replacement. Empty regions remained empty for long periods, shaped by the same environmental pressures that had limited earlier occupation. Human presence expanded unevenly, filling some spaces while leaving others untouched. These changes did not alter daily life for those who remained in stable regions. People continued to gather food, maintain shelter, and move within familiar ranges. The loss of distant populations occurred beyond their awareness, leaving no mark on routine or memory. Extinction, at this scale, was not a moment of ending. It was a process of thinning presence, reduced contact, and eventual absence. What remained were small populations carrying fragments of a wider human past, shaped by pressures that continued to act without recognition or pause. After the thinning of other human populations, one form remained across a widening range of environments. This presence did not announce itself as a conclusion or achievement. It reflected a particular alignment of bodies, behavior, and circumstance that proved workable across many regions at once. Measured against the long span of human existence, this arrangement is recent. For most of the time that humans of any kind lived on the planet, populations were small, scattered, and limited to narrow ranges. The form that would later be recognized as modern humans occupied only a brief portion of that history. Daily life during this period remained shaped by movement, local knowledge, and close dependence on surrounding environments. People continued to travel within familiar territories, adjusting routes as climate and resources shifted. Social life centered on small groups bound by shared activity rather than by formal structure. Changes that would later reshape human existence developed slowly and unevenly. The cultivation of plants and the management of animals appeared in some regions while remaining absent in others. These practices did not spread quickly or replace existing ways of living. They added new pressures and possibilities alongside older routines. Permanent settlements emerged only where conditions supported them. Access to reliable water, suitable land, and predictable seasons allowed some groups to remain in one place for longer periods. Even then, mobility did not disappear. People moved in response to shortage, conflict, or environmental change. Cities, as dense and enduring concentrations of population, belonged to a much later period. For most of human presence on the planet, life unfolded without permanent buildings, formal administration, or lasting divisions of labor. These developments rested on foundations laid long after the patterns described so far had been established. The closeness of this recent past to the present can obscure how narrow it is within the full span of human history. The ways of living that dominate recorded history occupy only a small fraction of time compared to the long period of movement, adaptation, and local adjustment that preceded them. This does not mark a turning point within the narrative so far. It places the familiar within a wider context shaped by contingency and change. Modern humans carry within them traces of earlier lives and lost populations, even as their recent forms of organization differ sharply from what came before. The strangeness of being us lies not in uniqueness or destiny, but in proximity. The present rests close to a past that was structured very differently, connected by continuity rather than by rupture. Life continues to unfold within conditions shaped by long processes that began far earlier and continue beyond any single moment. Human life continues within the same systems that shaped earlier forms. Bodies remain subject to temperature, disease, and the availability of food and water. Environments still set limits on movement and settlement, even where technology appears to soften those limits. The connection between people and the world around them has not been removed, it has been rearranged. There is no final form toward which humans have moved. Variation persists within populations, shaped by local conditions and patterns of movement. Traits that prove workable in one setting may lose relevance in another. Change remains uneven, guided by circumstance rather than direction. The ways people organize their lives continue to shift. Some arrangements spread widely, while others remain local or disappear. These changes do not replace earlier patterns all at once. Older practices persist alongside newer ones, interacting in ways that alter daily experience without resolving it. Human influence on surrounding environments has increased in some regions, altering landscapes and affecting other forms of life. These effects have accumulated through ordinary activity rather than through singular events. They reflect scale and repetition more than intention. At the same time, humans remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Climate variation, disease, and ecological change continue to shape where and how people live. Responses to these pressures differ across regions, producing new forms of adaptation that remain provisional. The presence of humans within the broader living world does not stand apart from earlier patterns. Other species have also reshaped environments, expanded ranges, and declined when conditions shifted. Human activity follows this pattern while introducing new pressures whose outcomes are still unfolding. Memory allows people to record and transmit experience across generations, extending influence beyond immediate presence. This capacity alters the pace of change without removing uncertainty. Decisions accumulate effects over time, often in ways not fully anticipated. The future of human life does not rest on a fixed trajectory. It will emerge from interactions between populations, environments, and systems that continue to change. These interactions remain shaped by limits as well as possibilities. The long history traced here does not close with arrival or completion. It continues within the present, connected to deep time through processes that remain active. Humans live inside this continuity, shaped by forces that began long before them and will persist beyond any single form they take. As attention drifts away from human lives, the wider world remains in motion. The planet continues its cycles of temperature, water, and growth, shaped by forces that operate across long spans of time. Day follows night, seasons shift, and landscapes adjust gradually to changing conditions. Rivers carry sediment from high ground toward the sea, altering their courses as they have many times before. Coastlines advance and retreat as water levels change, reshaping the edges of land. Wind and weather continue their work, wearing down stone and redistributing soil without pause. Plant life grows, spreads, and recedes in response to light, moisture, and temperature. Forests thicken in some regions and thin in others. Grasslands expand where trees withdraw, and wetlands form where water collects. These changes unfold slowly, often unnoticed by those living within them. Animals move through these environments, following patterns shaped by food, shelter, and breeding. Populations rise and fall as conditions allow. Some species adjust to altered landscapes, while others diminish and disappear. New forms appear over time, fitting into spaces opened by change. Human activity continues within this broader movement. People travel, settle, and alter their surroundings in ways that reflect immediate needs and accumulated habits. These actions add to existing pressures rather than replacing them. The world absorbs these influences as part of its ongoing change. The traces of earlier lives remain scattered across the surface of the planet. Stone tools weather into the ground, shelters collapse, and markings fade. Over time, these signs lose their connection to the people who made them, becoming part of the landscape itself. Time continues to pass, without regard for memory or meaning. Processes that shaped the distant past remain active, adjusting life and land through repetition rather than direction. The present moves forward within this continuity, shaped by forces that began long before and will persist beyond any single presence. As this story settles back into the wider rhythm of the world, there is no moment of closure. The conditions that gave rise to human life remain at work, and change continues without pause. Within this long movement, humans occupy only a brief span, one chapter among many, carried forward by time that does not stop or turn back.